Here, here.
All right, awesome. Just for the sake of the stream, I've been having a bit of connection problems sometimes, so it might be better if people who aren't speaking just make sure their cameras are off.
All right.
POIs in the chat would be awesome. Cool, cool, cool. Let's have a great round, y'all. 3, 2, 1. The totalizing narrative of colonial determination that exists in Africa and on our bench has crippled African development both economically and politically, leaving generations having failed to make the situation as good as it could have. Here's the model. How are these norms of colonial determinism normally communicated in status quo and in op world? I think that the pervasiveness is the key part of this. That is to say, first, let's talk about how they are actually implemented. I think this is through things like media, things like literature, things like the political discourse. But the pervasiveness is incredibly important because I think in op world, what happens is these are norms that are unquestioned by a overwhelming majority of the society. That is to say, no one questions them. It is anathema to challenge it. It is what textbooks say. It is what party lines say. It is what people in the nightly news say as defaults, much in the same way that Americans use the word freedom way too much. On our side of the house, on the government, we think that at the very least, it is up for discussion. That is, the majority of people do not believe that this is the totalizing only thing that people are responsible for the fate of an African country. I think that this means that you get pluralism on our side of the house, that you get narratives like we are strong regardless of our history. Our history isn't some strict binary of colonialism. We have heroes and villains in our history across the spectrum, wherever they came from, even though some of these people, heroes and villains, don't come from the imperial era. Things first on why colonial determinism is bad for economic development, and second, why it's bad for political development. A few things under this. First subpoint A, there is no accountability for current iterations of government on op side of the house. That is to say, in order to have policy iterations that have a meaningful democratic governance or even a meaningful authoritarian governance, you need to be able to hold your state accountable. That is to say, when someone is leader of your country says they're going to build a bridge and then they do not build a bridge, or they say they're going to manage a social welfare system, but then there is not enough money in it, you have to be able to directly hold them accountable for it. This is how, for example, you get exchanges of power, you get realistic changes, and you get things like the Amartya Sen argument about how democracies don't have famine. You have to be able to say that the old leader was the reason and the cause of your famine before you can end up getting them elected out of office and getting enough people to actually vote them out. Why do you not get that on their side of the house? Because what happens is you're able to blame colonialist, imperialist structures for the reasons why you cannot get things done. This looks like, for example, the ZANU-PF and the people in Zimbabwe being able to say these kinds of things and not get voted out and keep a vast plurality of the electorate for a very long time. Much in this, I know that it's not an African country, but Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela has done literally the exact same thing. Hugo Chavez did the exact same thing when the Misiones fell apart. You don't get policy iterations on their side of the house. I'll take a COPOI. What's up, y'all?
So what do you think is the largest cause for poverty and underdevelopment in these countries?
Yeah, so there are a lot of reasons why this poverty exists. One of them is you just don't get enough money into the system. There is a huge asymmetry of money. I'll talk in just 1 second about how that ends up getting worse on your side of the house. But secondly, I want to be very clear about this. Even if there is some badness that is attributed to imperialism, clearly, the key for governance is the change. That is to say, you have to get more people food within your term. You have to get more people aid. And you only get that on our side of the house when you can hold people accountable and say this relative rate is going down. You don't get that on their side of the house when you don't get this totalizing structure. I want to be very clear here about something that's really important. The average voter in a lot of these places is not very nuanced. That is to say, the average person, especially in Africa, where a lot more of the population is in poverty, is not actually paying attention to the vast majority of political discourses at a very high nuanced level. On our, that means that you don't get meaningful nuanced analysis on their side of the house if you are just blaming this one thing that is very easy, particularly when it is reaffirmed every single place you go. Second part of this argument about why it's bad for economic development is on development aid and money coming in. So there is a huge asymmetry of capital in Africa. That is to say, a lot of aid money just does not exist there. I think that there's a few reasons why you get less aid, particularly, or you get less money coming in on their side of the house. First, it is politically infeasible for leaders to accept aid from the West. That is to say, if the Western aid or Western imperialism is literally the reason why every evil in your country exists, you are not willing to take FDI or go into economic partnerships with places like the European Union, with places like the United States. This is because it is politically unfeasible to you. Secondly, I think that the average large population actually actively pushes back against these kinds of things. That is to say, if the Gates Foundation comes in and is trying to offer you vaccines, then you blow back at the evils of old imperialism, the Ford Foundation in the early 1900s, and you do not accept these vaccines. At the very least, you get protests against them, and you make it less likely that these same organizations will end up sending you aid. So there's a pushback from Africa from this aid. But this also creates a deterrent, secondly, for US and EU money to even enter Africa. Note that there is a scarcity here. That is to say, they can easily put their money somewhere else, like Southeast Asia or Latin America. When the West sees Africa as violently rejecting them, they are less likely to help, because it is first politically unpopular for these individual leaders who have a lot of discretion over where the foreign aid budget goes, but secondly, because they're scared that their impact won't be as high for the same reasons that I just gave you earlier. Third reason, I just want to be really clear, this harms even if you do get Chinese aid on their side of the house. That is to say, even if China is willing to offer you aid on their side, that you do not get competition for their deals. If the EU and the US are not offering you deals to compete with China, this is how you get those bad deals that end up meaning that you get stuck in a debt trap, that you end up ending up like the entire Angolan fucking GDP being owed to China because of their petrochemicals. This means you don't get competition on their side of the house. On our side, you get better negotiation because all these people are coming in and they get to fight for each other. Second substantive, why do you get better political outcomes on our side of the house? First, note the problem on their side of the house. When you antagonize Western ideology writ large, particularly given the lack of nuance, given that I already told you about, for the vast majority of voters, particularly in this world where there is very limited time and every soundbite is blaming the West for every single problem, you code the entire Western ideology into a binary of bad. Why is this bad? I think this means you can dismiss people who are advocating for something which clearly comes from the West, at least in its original form. There are 2 points where this is incredibly important. The first is feminist advocates and the people who are voting for or trying to create rights for non-men. I think this is particularly problem. As the second is democratization advocates who are pushing for using the Lockean ideology and other things like that. How are they crushed on their side of the house? Right at the beginning. This is really important. Feminist leaders never get a critical mass on their side of the house, because the second anyone comes forward and starts advocating for more equality of women, particularly in countries where you don't even have first wave feminism yet, where you still have female genital mutilation very frequently, I think that when these leaders step forward, they are immediately thrown with a scarlet letter of imperialism, of the West. And because of the pervasive normal colonial determinism, everyone shuts down. They stop listening to you. They stop platforming you. In the very best case, you just get ignored. But in the worst case, you get antagonized and you get backlash against you in your own very small society and community, which means that other people are deterred from even advocating for these things. I think this is the most important issue in this round, because first, it's just a vast majority of the people, but secondly, feminism and other things actually help with development insofar as you allow people to empower themselves and get more TFP. On our side of the house, we give you these things. We are proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for those fine words. I would now like to invite the Leader of Opposition to open the floor for the out case. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Awesome. I think the question that I'm left with coming out of the open government case is, what are they defending in the alternative? Because the problem for them is that narratives about determinism still exist on their side of the house. But instead of things like colonial structures, which is a targeted place where you can look at what we should be reforming and how we should be reforming specific institutions that were implemented by the West, things that are like bad conditions in Africa are blamed on things like ethnic groups, which are often artificially constructed by colonial determinism, or climate determinism, which is often impossible to overcome and is quite disempowering for the average voter that they say should be particularly scrutinizing these types of things. The relevant features of colonial determinism is that it suggests that your current institutions, the ones that surround you, and the norms and experiences you face with your neighbors, who might, for example, be from a different ethnic group, are worth questioning because they might be artificially installed and are likely harmful in many iterations. I want to be clear, being opposed to colonial structures does not mean being opposed to anything that comes from the West ever. That is, I think the way that this type of stuff happens and looks like in Africa is that highly conditional or controlled constrained versions of Western policies ought to be critically reevaluated and often reformed. So things like putatively democratic institutions that the West set up when they were fleeing from Africa in the 1900s might not be the best way to set up your government right now, because the ways that they were set up often privilege the elites in those transitions. I think those things are often the way that pro-democracy reformers, for example, in Africa, are currently operating, and is not the, oh, we should just be anti-democratic in the way that opening government seems to suggest. What happens without narratives of colonial determinism? Number one, the structures and institutions that surround you seem justified, and people operate within those structures as opposed to considering whether or not those ought to be reformed. The problem is twofold. Number one, many of those institutions are problematic and extractive, often completely limiting the capacity of African states to ever feasibly develop. That is, it's things like cronyist economic policies that were built up during colonial transition, where those who were powerful during the transition, often those who were able to be allied with the former colonizer, were able to access control of things like key state-owned enterprises or favorable trade deals. These are things that massively contribute to underdevelopment. That is, any government policy is usually highly skewed to generational elites, or revenues that could be used are stripped away in neo-patrimonial networks by cronyist allies of the state, which means that governments don't have budgets to run policies, and I think contributes a lot to underdevelopment in Africa. But even in the best case, where some of these institutions are putatively equitable, they are rarely reformed unless placed under extreme scrutiny. It's things like reasonable trade institutions that end up looking like, you know, all of North Africa having most favored nation status with France, or many African states having that same issue with their former colonizers, that look reasonable because those trade deals look favorable, but are often quite harmful for you because you're selling quite cheaply to those countries. It looks like democratic institutions that might not have been appropriate for states that needed things like strong security or strong democratic norms, but failed to meaningfully contribute to those norms, where the only people who were able to survive in your country were the very rich individuals, but those types of things were not created institutionally. A lot of times, this is important and a helpful thing for development. Old institutional features privilege certain classes or artificially orient the economy towards a certain type of production, like commodities productions, that are often harmful for these states' development in the long run. They are locked into certain things that privilege specific elites or privilege specific ways of life. This narrative incentivizes updating your institutions by a number of actors. First, people within these countries are vastly more critical of the institutions that surround them, versus on their side, either what ethnic group can I blame for my conditions, what climate feature can I blame for my condition, or even in the best case, what political leader am I choosing between, when those political leaders are often just two very rich individuals that benefited from colonialism. This means that much of the policy preferences of voters on our side focus on deeply structural issues, like making sure that elections are fairly contested, and not just that they function and that votes are happening, even if those votes are sham. Moreover, I think colonial determinism is pretty unifying along fractious ethnic groups. A lot of times, ethnic divisions between groups are obviously artificially constructed. This narrative pushes back on the blame that many ethnic groups place on one another for their economic condition. Because number one, it assigns blame to a unified external entity, which is the colonial structure, which often leads to key cooperation on a number of important issues, like building fairer and more accessible institutions by a bunch of different ethnic groups that care about these types of things. And two, it punctures the narrative that ethnic differences are meaningful, since it centers on the fact that many of these differences were artificially created by a colonial power. This, crucially, also contributes to cooperation across borders, because a lot of times conflict between states exists because of artificial borders or artificial disputes over resources that are blamed on things like deep intergenerational ethnic ties that supposedly existed for decades, but rather usually existed because of a unified colonial experience that is groups were being pitted against each other artificially. I think this makes it more likely that those ethnic conflicts are less likely, I guess, because they're being pushed back against by this narrative. I'll take a POI from CG, sorry.
All right. I'm pretty much confused about your characterization. Tell me why it is difficult for our side of the house to get rid of toxic structure if it is objectively toxic.
Well, one, I think to the extent that you think those things are justified or non-deterministic of your outcomes, you are more likely to blame it on a specific group, like an ethnicity, or a specific feature that you cannot change, like climate or the international order. These types of things, I think, are discrete targets for policy reform that usually do need some sort of narrative that suggests that people need to reform them, as opposed to, oh, it's just this particular leader is the problem, or this particular group is the problem, and those are the ways that we should be constructing our policies. This also, crucially, places a hard limit on the amount of blame that leaders can place on things beyond their control, even if it was leaders who are failing in economic conditions. OG says there is no accountability for state governments. The question is, where is blame placed on both sides of the house? Is it placed on the fact that your trade deals with France, who you're forced into during colonial transition, are worth renegotiating, which is more likely on our side of the house? Or is it on the Christian minority in your community is contributing to your economic demise, and those are the people worth our policy scrutiny? I think it is more likely when you care about colonial determinism, you focus on the macro structures and rarely focus on individual harms. Thirdly, colonial determinism also makes the target of reform clear. That is, a certain economic policy or voting institution is a thing worth changing. This is good because in poorer countries, there are a lot of different ways of dealing with development and reform. There's a lot of different things that you could be agnostic between. It's probably preferable to focus on policy stability. That is, focusing specifically on the things that colonialism said that you should not, or the colonialism introduced. Lastly, in international development circles, this discourse combats the racist narrative that these countries are just endogenously poor. Practically, this makes things like foreign aid better, because a lot of times foreign aid just doesn't exist for these countries because they just seem as if they are endogenously poor as opposed to colonially problematic. They say accepting this aid is politically infeasible. No, accepting highly conditional aid like the IMF tried to give African countries in the 1970s is probably politically infeasible. You have the opportunity to find other people that can give you aid and crucially play these actors off one another so that you can bargain for fairer deals. Sure, China's not great now, but I think these deals are improving for African states because of things like this narrative we're very proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for those fine words. I would now like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yep.
Awesome. This House regrets the pervasiveness of colonial determinism in discourse surrounding African development. Now note the two words, pervasiveness and determinism. I don't think the OG picked up on either, because we are not saying that there is just one narrative under our side of the house, that you would focus on just one other thing. We are saying that you would allow a multiplicity of views for the very first time, where currently there is an orthodoxy in which you only have one sort of sets of beliefs, where within Africa, but also within Western nations, you are constantly taught this is colonialism. This is how it defines Africa. This is what Africa is. I think that instills a more strong belief that Africa cannot do anything under their side of the house. But the second thing that I want to point out from that observation is that all their arguments about trying to make these colonial institutions better, if you believe in colonial determinism, then you believe that it's really, really hard, if at all possible, to make these institutions better. I think for all those reasons, people are much more likely to be nihilistic, and that's going to have huge consequences. But I do want to respond very quickly to their idea of there's alternative, which is determinism in climate or determinism toward ethnic groups. Like, I just don't necessarily think that's the case. Firstly, I think that people want to believe that there are paths to development for their country in a natural state. That is, if there wasn't this such a strong propaganda, you would want to believe that your home nation had a brighter and more beautiful future ahead of it. You would want to believe, for instance, that your nation could do better, that your children would live a better life than you. But secondly, there are paths to development that we develop more so under our side of the house, but also just paths to development in general. People think about solutions. People want their country to be better. We think that if we put smart people to it, there's no necessity for determinism. To the worst extent, right? We think that this colonial determinism, when compared to other determinisms, is particularly bad because it overlaps with so many of the other problems within the country. We want people to be solution-based. Having nihilism does not drive you toward that. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how this harms African countries internally. That is to say that their arguments about how there's determinism on climate or other ethnic groups miss the point. If you are deterministic about colonialism, then you never trust the things that could help you improve. That is, that you believe that the institutions that are broken right now will continue to be broken and that you cannot find solutions to them. The issue, those are inherently linked to things like other ethnic groups. On their side, you do not believe that electoral institutions can become better because the electoral systems that were set up and rigged by colonial governments were there and were always untrustworthy, were always rigged against one minority. That means that people do not turn out to vote. People do not trust political systems. People do not trust politicians in the very first place. That's not to say that we don't have skepticism under our side. Obviously, there is some degree of skepticism. But when people simply do not believe that voting will ever create change within their lives, people do not go out and vote in the very first place. Those systems will never succeed. But perhaps more crucially, even to the extent that they do vote, they'll never believe in compromise with other groups, right? We think that it's especially important in many of these nations that you get things like compromise governments, that you get governments in which people can see eye to eye and different multifaceted, multinational, and multi-ethnic societies can come together and say, look, we have differences. We clearly have had differences in the past, and the West has divided us, but we believe that we can move forward from colonialism and that we will not be forever divided. Crucially, this is institutional things like ensuring legislative seats being ensured for minority groups within certain nations. This looks like things like compromise governments, where you trust that the presidency will be rotated between different ethnic groups. These sorts of things never happen under their side of the house. I think that you're much more likely to descend into things like sectarian conflict under their side of the house. But also the thing to point out, like on their side, you blame colonial structures for the reason that the state is ungovernable. On our side, at least, you can't blame a small ethnic group for things like water systems drying or a famine in the same way that because they never control the country. I also want to bring up the point about social movements that Trent brings up, because this is crucial, right? Protest movements under their side of the house are always believed to be modeled in the form of the West. That is, that you do not believe that there are social movements that can be powerful and well organized without Western intervention, even if it is not in fact the case that they are a strong Western intervention. That means that local movements find it much, much more difficult to get off the ground. That's problematic, right? We think that there is genuine possibility for progress. We've seen it in places like Southeast Asia. We've seen it in places like, for example, some areas of the Middle East, but we think it's very, very difficult with the narrative of colonial determinism to get things like, for example, movements that outlaw marital rape, movements that allow for women to have more economic autonomy. We think that these things are incredibly important, and they are less likely to get those things under their side of the house because these movements are shut down violently by all the people who are rightfully skeptical of colonialism, but unfairly attribute this to colonialism. Happy to take a COPOI.
So while there might be potential benefits from engagement with the West, presumably there are also detrimental things, which NGOs sort of backfired and harmed these people. How do you weigh these two things up?
Yeah, I'm actually going to talk about that right now. But the overall point here is that without proper governance systems, you are much more likely to descend into direct conflict. You are much more likely to continue oppressing minorities. To whatever extent you still engage with the West, we don't think that those are the most fundamental problems. We think that the governance systems often are. But let's talk about how you engage with the outside world. I think that the level of Western engagement is really bad. Firstly, their argument about being endogenously poor doesn't change under either side of the house. The West thinks that these countries are shithole countries. It's not because of the narrative of colonial determinism. It's because people are racist. But the second thing I want to talk about is that Western engagement. I think that issue is that we want more Western engagement in a good way, but we also want to put thought to it. This also responds directly to the COPOI. I think that the West always has incentives to do shitty things in Africa. They always have incentives to extract resources. They always have incentives to beat down on them. They have existing ties there. They have industry that wants resources from there. Why do we make those sorts of things better? I think the crucial thing to recognize is that in the West right now, there's a really problematic situation in which the people who are against colonialism also believe that colonialism can never be solved or addressed properly. And therefore, when they see things like, for example, IMF imposing austerity measures in Africa, they see things like, for example, industries investing terribly within Africa, they see things like, for example, whatever the bad thing in Africa is, they back out of the movement in the very first place. That is to say that these people, instead of responding by trying to create policy and think of ways that the West can do better, they instead do not enter the fields of policy or scholarship that work towards these sorts of things. That means, firstly, that you do not have scholars of Africa with diverse views that say things like, for example, there are better solutions specifically that we can work to in giving aid to Africa. These policy platforms are incredibly crucial in determining what the government will do, because often governments are informed by think tanks and outside advisors as to what policies might be more effective. But the second thing is, these scholars are important in just guiding public and social discussion in the West about engagement with Africa. Under your side, yes, you do get critique of modern ills like the IMF or whatever, invasive investment practices, but the dominant resulting belief is the West shouldn't do these things or the West won't engage. They will always do these things, crucially. And so what we want is, under our side, people believing that you can change and believing that the West can be a part of making this place better, therefore contributing to policy. That is, we want the anti-colonialists talking about this. But the final thing to talk about is that the China as an alternative model is exactly what we get under our side of the house. The problem is when China is roughly your only option because you've alienated the West and because you're more proximate to China supposedly because you're super anti-colonialist, that is your only option. You get far worse options. This is terrible because you don't get servicing of public debt. And the debt burdens that you take on by joining the BRI are often so onerous that you have to give up huge amounts of natural resources, and China directly takes your resources because you're not able to pay them back. We think this takes money away from them as well. For all these reasons, happy to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for those fine words. I would now like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close off the upper half debate. Here.
Okay, am I audible to a suitable degree?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. Give me 1 second. All right. What was our thesis? Our thesis was twofold. First, when you have a colonial determinist narrative, you get clear targets for reform in a way that they don't get on their side of the house. And second, the comparative determinist narratives are worse. Let's talk about the second part first, because the first part is going to be integrated throughout the entirety of the speech. Let's talk about what the comparative determinist narratives are. I think one is that you have endogenous ethno-linguistic fractionalization. People believe that all the different types of ethnic groups that are present within their country means that there will never be progress because these people are too opposed to one another, and therefore you can never collaborate on things like voting reform or never collaborate on meaningful economic change to help promote the development of the country. This is why states often go to war with one another, despite the fact that prior to the colonial power being present and dividing up the state, they were the same country with a unified ethnic base, but now they believe they're oppositional states. This is the type of thing that controls development outcomes in Africa in many instances, because one, these legacies are extremely powerful in the sense that people's survival in a day-to-day sense in the colonial structure was often determined by their ethnic status, and two, because now artificial borders, such as the border between Sudan and South Sudan, these are the types of things that were implemented precisely to divide up ethnic groups in order to support the the colonizer. I'm going to talk a little bit about why their responses to this argument are incredibly flippant and not sufficient, but I just want to point out that that type of thing is incredibly powerful in the status quo within Africa, where people believe that their country can never succeed because, one, they don't even believe their country is a meaningful entity in the sense that they think that it is too divided to be a country or too divided to be successful in the long run. And also, it means that you never have the type of programmatic competition between politicians who are advocating different types of reform on their side of the house, because it's never actually programmatic electoral competition. It's things like clientelism, where you only distribute benefits to your individual ethnic group or to your particular enclave of the country. What do we get then on our side of the house? This is the first part of our thesis. We get a target for reform, specific things that you can levy fact claims against as being responsible for the current state of your country. We get on our side of the house pointing out that there are certain voting structures, such as the way that political party money is distributed in Tanzania, that is a holdover from political days that actually favors the elites or favors a certain ethnic group. This is the type of thing that I want to crucially note that is unique for our side of the house for two reasons. One is because these structures are incredibly ingrained, there are huge collective action problems inherent with overcoming it. This is why the CGPOI, if this alludes to their extension, will be wildly insufficient, because if they want to just say we can get reform on their side of the house, no, you need to have an overwhelming narrative and a consensus in order to believe that these things are worth investing the huge amounts of political and economic capital and getting rid of. That's what we uniquely have on our side of the house, and that's why this narrative is pervasive. Second is that there's a large amount of inertia of these institutions. That is to say, people have lived with them their entire lives, so it's very difficult to imagine a world absent to them, which is why it's important to have a narrative and a discourse that is dominated by the belief that these things should go away. What is the weighing of this mechanism? I want to point out a couple of things. So OG has two ways that they affect economic and political change. One is accountability, which was largely dropped in the last speech, and second is aid. This is pretty much where they hang their hat. I want to note that we outweigh in a vast majority of instances, even if we take all of their arguments at their best. Because first, the type of endogenous political fractionalization that harms political development in the long run is often just vastly orders of magnitude more important than aid, the amounts of money that they could, in the best case, get on their side of the house. Like, aid budgets are hundreds of millions of dollars, but the type of economic development that is lost through corruption because of patronage or clientelism are on billions and trillions of dollars in the long run, because these countries never have a long-term impetus to endogenously develop. So even if we take all of their arguments about a slightly better sets of aid deals and trade deals on their side of the house, this is not ever going to be enough to win on their side. But second, notice that this is capped, right? You can inject certain amounts of liquid capital from their side of the house, but if there are institutions that structurally privilege certain people that continue to exist and can never be reformed because the collective action problems are too strong, then this type of capital only goes so far and often gets captured by elites. So what were the mechanisms on our side of the house, and why were these mechanisms so good and so effective? One is we changed the beliefs of elites. I think this is probably one of our better arguments, in the sense that the people who literally govern have a different set of expectations about what they should be doing when they're in power. Second is we changed the beliefs of voters. This is crucial in the sense that now they're not just adjudicating between different leaders because that leader has a different allegiance to a certain type of party, but it's also who can offer the best program to get away from the colonial structures. But third, I think we direct the natural pessimism of being in poverty or being underdeveloped relative to where you think you should be towards a meaningful target for reform that is overturning the colonial structures. What is the worst case then for us, and why even in the worst case do we win this round? Because one, we affect people's attitudes at the margins, whereas I don't understand how they do, right? I don't know how people get more optimistic on their side, as the DPM just asserts at the top of their speech. There's no mechanism there. But second, in the worst case for us, we at least have policy stability. Even if it is totalizing, as they allege, we have to do one thing in order to unify the country. Like, that is the narrative here. So you don't get this type of really rapid policy switching that often occurs and destabilizes a country, where you go protectionist one year and then really liberalize the next year. Okay, before I move on, I will take OG.
Yeah, so if the status quo defaults to ethnic identities and rejecting the state, that is literally your world. This is a regrets motion. Even in your best case, you ignore the fact that this is irredeemable according to the motion, and that these things compound on each other.
Okay, first of all, the comparative would be much worse. And I also think that people are, like, these countries are improving as a result of this narrative. It takes time, right? But I also think that, like, obviously it's not irredeemable. The deterministic part is not saying it will never be better. It is just saying the present problems are created by long ago structures, right? Like, that is the analysis. It's not just because there is these colonial legacies that there are going to never be change. It's just that the current problems are created by that. Okay. So the main response we hear from OG is you can't overcome these things because it's too hard. I think the harder and more ingrained these institutions are, the more stringent the collective action problems inherent with overturning them, et cetera, et cetera. Let's do some responses to their arguments about aid. So first of all, if you are getting bad aid, I want to note that these types of bad trade deals are the way that old colonial structures continue to adhere in the status quo, right? These things like unfavorable trade deals are the ways that countries have historically been disadvantaged in the past that continues in the present. If it is true now that you have scrutiny on the types of behavior of the West, you can pick and choose between the different types of aid deals that are offered to you. This is why their comparative about China doesn't make a lot of sense, because if China is offering you terrible, terrible deals, then if the prevailing narrative within your country is that you shouldn't be subject to colonial oppression again, you're going to have a lot more scrutiny on these types of things. Notice that these deals often seem good, things like IMF structural adjustment, where they say we're going to inject a certain amount of capital, but if you were not careful, they are actually very bad because they come with huge conditions and strings attached. This is also explains why, on their side of the house, the deterrent argument for the West doesn't make that much sense, because if African countries are picking and choosing between different types of deals, it doesn't mean that they're writ large rejecting all types of aid. So clearly the US and other states have an incentive to go in and provide some degree of aid, but notice that it can't be conditionalized in a way that reeks of colonialism, which a lot of times these modern deals are. I think that that is important. So even in the best case for them to get a little bit more development aid, but that's never going to overcome our structural arguments on our side of the house. Very proud to be on OO.
I thank the DLO for those fine words. That ends the upper half debate, and now for the lower half debate. May we have the member of Gov?
Okay, sorry, let me get my timer.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I have 2 observations for opening half. For opening government, I think they don't prove what the comparative word is. Why it's necessary to neglect this narrative in order to promote more beneficial development for the African nations on the ground. The burden, implicit burden the government has in this debate is proved why overridingly getting rid of this narrative is something essential in this debate. And notice, vast majority of analysis coming from opening government is just assertion. They lack the mechanism in terms of the human psychological reaction or what kind of context that exists within Africa. But firstly, let's engage with opening opposition's idea about exclusive narrative is likely to happen. We think that's actually opposite, and we think that more exclusive narrative is likely to happen within anti-colonial narrative within their side of the house. This is because, historically speaking, there has been divisional policy by the colonial states. For example, Britain intentionally divided this ethnicity, privilege one over other, so that they can avoid unified anti-colonialism, so that they can avoid unified opposition against Britain. That's why they actively, intentionally created this divisional policy. So we saw this happen in India in terms of Hindu individual being privileged over Muslim individual. We saw this happen in Rwanda, where minority was privileged over majority. Conclusion of this is, firstly, the privilege within the community has been privileged, which means that it reminds them of the sense of unfairness that this minority or majority ethnicity has been facing. That's why all the things that they say. Firstly, in terms of instability or polarization is more likely to increase within their side of the house. Firstly, because you continue reminding the unfair anti-colonialism that has existed. Secondly, other ethnicity party will continue blaming on you for the things you said, because these are the things that unfavor these groups. That's why polarization, instability is rather likely to increase within their side of the house. But second argument, why the political culture is likely to be very worse and emotional within their side of the house. We think, firstly, the rhetoric of liberation and creating freedom and anti-colonialism is very powerful for two reasons. A, because it plays on the fears and memory of having terrible state of living, and these politicians is able to galvanize support. Powerful rhetoric that we liberated these individuals from the oppressor is precisely the narrative that these politicians are able to use. B, which means that these politicians is able to unite the people based on the shallow grounds by forming common enemy and hatred, despite the fact that they don't have any meaningful policy. That's why, for example, we saw in ANC of South Africa or Congress Party of India being able to cement power for decades, automatically winning votes by using this narrative. Secondly, we think that they are likely to exacerbate conflict within the borders, because they want to attack the other people. They want to say that this arbitrary border is created by colonialism. This leads to a situation where African leaders have large incentives to undermine and destabilize the borders, which means more wars, which means more political conflicts, and which means more populist narrative on the ground. But thirdly, we say emotion-based narrative is more likely within their side of the house. A, because there's no past data, because it is like 50 or 60 years ago, coming up with this data is very difficult. But B, even if the data exists, the colonialist country obviously erased and get rid of this data so that they don't want to be blamed. But C, even if they exist, they are likely to be crowded out by the emotional narrative. A, because this emotional narrative is more accessible for the average people on the ground who are not necessarily educated. That's why the emotional narrative is likely to be exacerbated and perpetuated within their side of the house. Why is emotion something problematic? A, because it is one-sided. Because you have hatred towards the opponent, you are not willing to listen to the other people. B, because it's very difficult to respond. Because it's based on emotional and subjective hatred, you cannot rationally deny the subjective experience of these people. C, because it has been internalized within centuries, within decades. These people continue to pass it off to their children, to their parents, to their grandchildren. That's why it is deeply internalized within their side of the house. D, when they are attacked, when they are denying their colonial experience, they are likely to act self-defensive because they feel their core identity is under attack. That's why they are likely to be self-defensive. Within outside of the house, the discourse is likely to be based on merit. Firstly, because we remove all this emotional toxic narrative that is uniquely created by their narrative. But secondly, we are able to do objective discussion, such as talking about KPI, talking about GDP, talking about who's the best partner to economically develop, or who we should rely on, what sort of developmental policy we should have uniquely happens within outside of the house. Third of all, there's benefit to self, so you can gain economic benefit, and especially for the first time, these people are able to recognize what are the sort of status quo problems that they are happening. But fourthly, it is likely to be more inclusive. Unlike the divisional policies that opening opposition talk about, we under outside of the house, things like Ebola, things like health crisis, things like poverty is something that everyone can relate to. That's why inclusiveness is rather better within outside of the house. Why is this all of this important? Firstly, because under their side of the house, it is likely to increase corruption and the unaccountable. A, governments that are not accountable based on economic and developmental policy because they can rely on this anti-colonial narrative and pretend that they are doing good. B, they don't have to give good policy because they can already satisfy these individuals by the perception of anti-colonialism. C, state will be perceived as a hero. They will be perceived as a significant state of the history that has tackled down this colonialism. That's why it's difficult for the citizens to challenge the state, because that's why ANC, these party has been prevailing developmental policy despite the fact that they are not implementing meaningful policy. But the second impact is about Western institutions, which was under-mechanized at the point of OG. Firstly, we think Western companies are less willing to join, A, because they feel the political narrative within this state is unstable, B, they feel that they may face things like boycott or demonstration or strike, which is harmful for their profit. That's why they have less incentive to enter this market. But second, we think that Western institution is difficult. OG asserts this, but here's the mechanism. Firstly, because it will be betrayal to your voting bloc. You used to say that you used to push this policy based on anti-colonialism. You will see as a contradictory actor. B, even if you flip, opposition party can deny you. Opposition party can blame you for flipping your narrative. C, we think the strongman image will be lost. The moment you make concession, your strongman image that you deny colonialism is likely to be lost. That's why this party, under their side, has no incentive to rely on Western institutions, which leads to all the competition mechanism DL will talk about is more likely within our side of the house, because for the first time, we have Western institution as a choice. For all these reasons, very proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the member of GOP for that fine speech. I would now like to invite the member of opposition to make a case for closing up.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, lovely. Just give me a second. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In this speech, we will do three things. Firstly, we will prove that determinism is still the alternative of government side. So we will do what opening opposition doesn't do, since I think even though this response, if true, would debunk most of government's claims and make it not very exclusive, they don't actually do a good job of proving it mechanistically. We'll explain why we get that. Secondly, we will also explain why on our side you have considerably more unity and safety for the average person, and why that's a prerequisite to every other benefit. And then thirdly, I'll explain the discursive split, why this means more aid from Western countries. So, first argument, and I'm just going to rebut inside the argument, so just watch out for that. I'll also flag it anyway. So firstly, we will prove that determinism is not mutually exclusive versus opening opposition's assertion. Moreover, we will also prove that it's equally as persuasive. Therefore, the harm still exists on government side. There are several reasons why this is the case. I haven't counted them all, but there are several of them. Why determinism is a natural consequence absent this narrative. Firstly, politicians have an incentive to blame the problems of society on something else anyway, which is why they're likely to skirt blame, whether it be blaming a particular ethnic group or whether it be blaming a particular circumstance. Note that they're most likely to blame other ethnic groups, aside from the fact that people are probably more responsible for a lot of things, but more importantly, they're responsible for a lot of things that people care about, like corruption, like war, and like conflict. Moreover, it's easier to humanize and understand these things, which is why it's far easier to get angry at these things. Secondly, a particular deterministic narrative is uniquely captivating compared to all other narratives because it's a digestible view of the world, of the problems in your world and in your life, that painted in bold strokes of black and white in a way that no other narrative, whether it be a confluence of narratives, does. Thirdly, it's a way for nations to rationalize being proud of their identity despite somehow being poor and despite somehow being their fault. Fourthly, it intertwines with pre-existing religious narratives, such as one saying that it was your fault, it was divine punishment. Fifthly, a massive destruction in colonization necessitated a narrative of equal potency and weight to challenge it after that colonization. The five massive destructive things like territory conflicts over borders post-scramble for Africa. 2, the allocation of resources and the division of class. 3, the ruination of institutional trust. 4, the development of conflict and group cleavages. And 5thly, even just robbing your country and enslaving your people. So these things demanded something equally persuasive to fight it back. Note that these all prove that some form of determinist narrative would have arisen and something that would have blamed or exacerbated ethnic strife in that country, creating more conflict and losing out on unity. But let's say that they have a world absent an overriding persuasive determinist narrative. Why is this even worse? We think the natural conclusion is for them to say that colonization was a good thing, that colonialism was something that benefited them. There are 6 reasons why this is the case. Firstly, because colonial nations had previously cracked down on people that went against this narrative, which means that the amount of intellectual thinkers who support this thought are quite low. Secondly, you have the ability to hide any countering historical data, which is CG's arguments, which means you have to believe it as true. Thirdly, colonial nations had post-colonial flooding of goods and services, which made countries dependent on them economically. So from a perspective of economic need, you feel the need to cozy up with these countries, since post-devolution and decolonization, your country was massively weakened and economically destroyed. Fourthly, the use of social institutions such as religion in other instances to make you believe like this was the white man's burden and that was a good thing for them to colonize you. Fifthly, you're forced to undo centuries of programming and massive propaganda in schools, which indoctrinated you in their language and their culture. But sixthly, elites that benefited from colonialism remain at the top of a social hierarchy where you believe colonialization is a good thing, which is why they're likely to support this and prop up this narrative. This means that in a range of all possible alternative narratives, their harms get worse. One, because it's easier to blame it on other things, but more importantly, other people, which exacerbates their conflict. Not only does this prove all of opening opposition benefits, it widens the scale and valence of these harms by making things far worse for the average person. But moreover, in the world where you don't have any of these alternative narratives, the persuasive existing narrative that remains instead is one that says colonization was a good thing. They say colonialism is more widespread than anything else. We think exactly, but they haven't proven that people will think of it as a bad thing. We think the natural alternative is actually, since it was the narrative that controlled them for so long, we think they're likely to perceive it as a good thing. So before I move on, at the end of this argument, we're already winning. Firstly, because it resolves the cleavage in top half, and it's a prerequisite to believe any of opening opposition's benefits. Two, it proves a range of terrible and highly impactful outcomes beyond opening opposition's outcomes. So, for example, increasing the likelihood of ethnic strife. For example, the existence of unity. Note that safety existing in your country is a prerequisite to get any of these benefits. That you had to get out of that problem in the first place. That you have to get out of that turbulent times in the first place before you can start thinking about development. We're the only country that guarantees you that. But more importantly, we also weigh harder on unity by proving that this is the prerequisite to anything else, which is why we overturn most of Gov's benefits. So it's for these reasons that we're already winning. I'll take POI from opening Gov now.
Look, these people live in the country. They have family members that went through this. They see the struggle that resulted from colonialism. Under your side, a belief that colonialism is irredeemable means that you believe you'll always remain divided. You'll never trust or work with the other group because the colonizers set you up to fail and you believe that you'll always fail. On our side, we at least have incentives to work together for policy toward a brighter future because you believe that you can change these things.
Again, that's hung on there not being an alternative determinist outcome. We've already proven why we win that. But I think the more important thing is our side is actually considerably more unifying for the reason that everybody can say they were fucked by colonization, they were fucked by colonialism, which is why it's possible to unite and work together because you believe that you don't want an alternative colonial state. But moreover, it's actually easier to hold politicians accountable. One, for the reason that it's easier, it makes people more skeptical of the state because corrupt, terrible politicians heavily exemplify the characteristics of colonialism: taxation without representation, stealing your goods, imperialism, just being a general dick, and discriminating people. These are all characteristics of colonization that you want to not happen again in your state because you've already seen how it's indelibly affected your country before, which is why actually we get most of the impacts of opening Gov because people are far more likely to rally and fight against these things for the same reasons that they give. But more importantly, we also think that you get considerably more aid and support. So we've proven that pervasiveness and determinism in even the worst case are still quite good. We also think this doesn't just occur in developing countries. It's also massively this is the incentive for you to have aid in the first place in white countries. So this discourse was global. It was all over the world. So we think that the discourse, for example, about the United States' responsibility towards the global South post-World War II was what motivated things like the Marshall Plan, was what motivated things like the upliftment of poverty and in the third world, as well as ensuring that they would have food to eat and that they would have trade deals that would at least let them survive. Comparative is these states would blame it on their culture. These states would blame it on their economic conditions. These states would blame it on things that you couldn't change, but at the very least were not their fault. So in a world where states believe it is partially their fault and the average individual in the white country feels guilty for these kinds of things, it is where you're actually more capable of getting aid. It is where you're capable of reducing discrimination and having incentives to reduce conflict, having incentives to broker peace deals between warring countries because you believe it is your fault, because you have indelibly affected these countries so much. On either side, perhaps you might feel like nothing you can do to change, but at the very least on our side, you make people feel guilty. Note that this argument is really, really important because it's the prerequisite, again, to many of their benefits. It's a prerequisite to having aid in the first place and to be capable of competing for aid. But more importantly, it proves that the narrative internal to these white countries is actually a really, really good thing. even if nothing changes within these developing countries, because of the fact that it makes life far better for the average individual. So at the end of this speech, take away three things. Firstly, we prove that the alternative government supports is false and far worse. Secondly, we prove that even if they don't have that alternative, the arising narrative out of that is actually considerably worse since it supports colonialism, which means other outcomes are impacted and far worse. But even if you don't believe any of that, we're still the only side that provides solvency for the harms that the average person in these places experiences. It is for these reasons that you must negate. Thank you.
I thank the member of opposition. I would now like to invite the Gov Whip to wrap up the case for side Gov.
Hello, am I audible and visible? And like, can you hear me?
Yep.
Right. So. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Beginning with kicking out opening government, because that makes it clear what Toshiya have proven to you. The point out from opening opposition against opening government was very correct when they say, that it's theoretically still possible for African nation to receive Western education and Western, let's say, aid, etc., etc. And most of the OG's contribution is to impacting aid from the Western country and all whatnot. But the point is, Deputy Prime Minister didn't choose not to respond to this claim and didn't differentiate why this narrative is overwhelmingly strong to the extent that it washes out the capability for African nation to do a meritocratic decision making within their own political dynasties, like political decision making, which is why Toshiya's argument becomes important, because we told you why it is going to be comparatively easier for our side of the house to implement more meritocratic decision making within its political arena. We analyzed to you this nature of this pervasiveness, unlike opening government, which just said it is written in the textbook. We told you, one, it is emotion hard to dispute, but two, it's going to be more self-defensive, but three, we told you how this polarizes the discussion and you decapacitate individual to listen to the other side of the story and other like additional 3 layers of analysis as to why this is going to be pervasive. Given that closing opposition failed to respond to this argument, this means that closing opposition also concedes with the argument about aligning with the FDI and aligning the Western institution. Thus, the impact stands there. Based on that, I'd like to do 2 things. Firstly, I'd like to look at how the narrative is constructed in this debate, and secondly, I'd like to talk about the relatability, why relating with the advanced country is going to be beneficial for this developing country. All rebuttal are integrated. So, first question about how the narrative are going to be constructed. Note, interestingly, closing opposition took a really similar line with the opening opposition. However, I think, the way how they approached it was pretty different. Now, I think the importance of this argument is, the importance of this, the impact of this argument is that if we can prove to you that the narrative that we support under our side of the house is likely to be the case, then most of our argument stands. That is to say, if the narrative is the more meritocratic, then it means we kick out opening opposition's argument. Because note that the main contention from opening opposition was that it is difficult for these countries to point out the toxic problems, and that we cannot get rid of it. If we can prove to you this meritocracy as a political decision making, we kick out this argument. So firstly, let's look at what opening opposition talked about. They said, it's going to be ethnic division. Toshiya successfully rebutted this argument about arguing how the political discussion are actually dominated, looking at the nature of the politicians. Note that most of the politicians in these countries gain power through the rhetoric of this rhetoric of colonial determinism. What does this imply? This implies, number one, that these politicians are from an extreme rich, privileged background, which means they are in the majority race. But secondly, they are oftentimes from a military background at the end of the day. But thirdly, because they are from a military background, there's more likelihood of these politicians being corrupted. What does corrupted mean? Corrupted means that this politician have active incentive to align with the privileged individual, align with the majority, and ignore the minority at the end of the day. Which is why the structural conclusion here is that even on the side of the opposition, this racial oppression, racial oppression and ethnic division still does exist on the side of the opposition, which is going to be the logical response to opening opposition. Unlike opening government would just say, aha, we still have it, and what is the margin? Well, that is actually true, but we need to mechanize it, and I did you by 5 mechanisms, which is why we cannot help but to say that opening opposition's argument as well as closing opposition's argument is completely non-mutually exclusive. They cannot say alternative concept does exist, because the concept already does exist for the multiple reasons, for the exact same reasons that the opposition side argued, which is why you cannot just buy into that argument. All opposition side needed to prove to us what is the difference, how they get rid of it, when we already see that these problems are existing under the status quo at the end of the day. But more importantly, I would like to kick this argument out. What does this regret motion mean? This means we are able to fiat that we are able to get rid of this let's say colonial determinism. Now, what is the likely scenario in which it is possible for us to kick out colonial determinism? It is number one, possibly, like for example, Truth and Reconcile Committee have been successful, or two, reparation may have been paid sufficiently at the end of the day, so that people really don't care about this, these instances. In that instances, I think people doesn't have this massive anger in the first place, thus they don't really be stressed to like blame other ethnicity at the end of the day. For all that reason, non-mutually exclusive, as well as not telling us like what's the unique difference, but also I don't think it is likely to happen for the reason that I've gave you from our side. Thus, the form of the narrative that's likely to happen under our side of the house is going to be more, let's say, meritocratic basis. Two reasons. Number one, because meritocracy is something easy for a politician to measure, because it is purely based on number in the first place, KPI, etc. But second, because we don't need to respond to the emotion argument, which is very difficult to rebut. It is possible to assume that more people buy into this narrative about this meritocracy. Secondly, focusing on the impact of a developed country on our side of the house. Now, closing opposition had this unique observation about 7 observations, but if you look into it, none of it was really impacted, right? And none of it was even weighed against what Toshiya have said. Previous speaker talked about, it's going to be, the language is going to be implemented. But what is the problem? Being able to speak English means that you have more economic opportunity. And if you are more wealthy, then probably the likelihood of you discriminating others are going to decrease. The probability of you dying for hunger is also likely to decrease. Like, what is the problem, right? You need to impact that under your side of the house. But second, they talked about the dependence to Western institutions. Like, why is it bad? I would like to argue why this is going to be beneficial on our side of the house. But before that, let me just simply make it clear that there are an actual trade-off between we are actually trading off the Western institution and Western support, unlike opening government remechanized to you from our side of the house. And this is answering the question of the leader of the opposition, that is to say, why it is mutually exclusive. The first reason is because of the incentive of the developed country, advanced country. Now, so the previous speaker said, this sense of guilt is going to allow United States to invest more on this African nation. Like, totally lie. Number one, because we don't really see that much in the first place. But second, politicians don't really care about this because they are less likely to get elected, even if they claim so, because the general voter only cares about the issue relating to themselves. It may be decreasing taxation, etc. But thirdly, because of that, we see like many Black Lives Matter protests existing right now, and people recognize for the first time ever that racism and this past colonialism was something problematic, empirically untrue for them to claim that people feel guilt under their side of the house. But second, because the Western institution as well as advanced country fear the risk of these backlashes, fear the risk of they being harassed by the local individuals, they don't want to enter this area, which is why they rather choose to go to Asia at the end of the day, which is why massive economic opportunity is lost under their side of the house. Note, closing government is the only one analyzed to you. What is the pervasiveness means? What is this emotional discussion? How this emotional discussion looks like? How it is difficult to dispute this at the end of the day? And we also characterize to you what kind of political structure does exist on the side of the opposition and how it will change on our side of the house. We comprehensively take this debate.
I thank the Gov Whip for that speech. I would now like to invite the opposition whip to wrap up this debate as a whole. Here.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, nice. POIs in the chat. If I don't take one by the 6 minutes, feel free to interrupt my speech. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. The first thing I want to do is resolve the opening debate. Because Gov comes up here and says that this is about colonial determinism. But a lot of the arguments are about why determinism is a problem or fatalism is a problem. Because inherently, if you believe a lot of their claims about why it's bad to not blame your leaders and hold them accountable, that's probably transferable to any other form of determinism, which I think opening opposition rightly points out. And notably also, at no point does Gov really challenge the harm of other narratives being existent, like cultural determinism, biological determinism, religious determinism even, as factors for development and why they're probably worse. The greatest challenge Gov says is that it's unlikely that these will be the narratives that exist. So when closing opposition comes up in this debate and explains to you why it's very likely that the determinism will not be a changing factor on either side, we take the debate over everyone already, which you're able to successfully do, and I don't think there's sufficient response coming from the previous speaker. Coming from David, you pointed out that at this time, like in the 1960s or sometimes in the 90s, depending on when African post-colonial states were liberalized, or liberated rather, they had massive inequality, massive suffering, and massive problems. This is important because the only way to rationalize that is to blame other people for it, but B, the only way for you to get the converse, which is free will and agency determines it, is if you're able to see different people from similar backgrounds having different levels of success. If you believe that they're historically robbed by colonialism and therefore they're significantly harmed, it's unlikely that people had different backgrounds and different people from different likelihoods of success. And therefore, people are unlikely to say that it is possible for you to change your well-being. It's possible for you to strive beyond these conditions. The likely outcome is just to say it's problematic. But beyond that, we said it aligns with religion. It aligns with the Christian religions that are being imposed to them by colonialism, with things like divine providence, God's plan, but also aligns with all of the pre-colonial religions. Things like animism largely believes in the control of the spirit world over you, and therefore you don't really have a lot of agency to exert. But thirdly, it also aligns with a lot of the colonial justification. The fact that colonialism wanted to remove the people's idea of agency because they wanted them to feel like they depended on other factors, or the fact that colonialism tried to justify itself by doing things like manifest destiny, like the white man's burden, which justify, let's say, their destiny and fate to go to a particular area. All of them align with trends of determinism. So for you to believe government then to say that they'll be able to extricate that, they have to explain why all these other values that shape the mindsets of people would have been taken away, which they're not able to do. Before we move on, OG.
Look, even if determinism and tribalism are awash, Chinese aid and crackdowns on feminist movements are uniquely associated with the belief that Africa cannot escape the West. We get rid of that crippling debt, and we also allow feminist movements to get basic rights for women like we would on our side.
Yeah, so I think there are parts of your argument that is not reliant on determinism, which I will deal with in a bit. But I just want to point out that we're clearly winning this issue, and that OO asserted it. The only reason we got coming from OG really about why they're not likely to be deterministic is that they say an assertion that people naturally crave for freedom, which is not true. There are a lot of people in the world right now who are subjugated in a socially constructed framework. It's unclear why they're likely to crave for freedom on either side. But secondly, a lot of people like being dependent. A lot of people like being controlled because it allows them to predict their life. It's unclear why that's a natural assertion. So compare that to the structural reasons we provide, we clearly take that issue already. The thing from CG was to say, well, they have a fiat to remove this. Yes, they have a fiat to remove the specific narrative of colonial determinism. That's not the only deterministic narrative, and therefore they don't win that way. But secondly, they just say, it might as well work because of a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. If you believe the analysis coming from David later, which is absent this, you're likely to have a pro-colonial narrative, then this is unlikely for you to work under their side of the house. Okay, dealing with CG's extension then. So they say they become a more meritocratic government because one, they're able to disentangle emotions from the narrative. This assumes that the other narratives don't have emotions. We explain to you why they likely do. The fact that you have hatred over a particular race or religion, the fact that you believe other people are sinners, are also a lot of emotional arguments that people run right now. In fact, emotions are probably worse when you're going against people within your own state, because when you're proximate to one another, they're more likely to have things like flashpoints. You're more likely to see each other, and once you demonize one person, they demonize you back, and you create that cycle of demonization against each other versus a detached colonial narrative. But lastly, we would suggest that at best, colonialism tempers your emotions over time, because over time people don't care so much about colonialism, versus on the other side where it's a concept narrative which is likely to trigger a lot of emotions. Then they say, well, for you to be a leader in these kinds of states, you need to be a military leader and you have to come from a privileged background. It's unclear why it's mutually exclusive. These things are essential for you to be able to guarantee your security and be able to fund elections. These are not inherent to any colonial narrative. But secondly, if you say it's because the colonial leaders are privileged and from military backgrounds, presumably religious ethnic leaders are also privileged and come from military backgrounds. Presumably also there are multiple different people in the colonial struggle, and therefore you can have multiple leaders and therefore be competitive. So the entire claim about why meritocracy is good is co-optable on either side of the house. Okay, even if you then don't believe that we're likely to become deterministic, they've provided you the likely counterfactual, which is you're likely to become pro-colonial. And the reason as to why this is the case is because it's not true that after colonialism, everyone just like disappeared and everyone hated colonialism. We gave you the structural reasons why after the time of colonialism, they're likely to become pro-colonial. The fact that they had control of education, control of the media, control of recording history, control of post-colonialism, and therefore brand with advertisements of the lifestyle that they live. But lastly, it's the only centralized narrative at that time because they likely controlled a lot of the propagations of narrative that exists. And therefore, it's likely to be the strongest narrative that a lot of people have. The fact that elites also are not imbibing these narratives because they benefited from colonialism. Why is this important? If Gov says that there are some benefits to dealing with pro-colonialism or dealing with colonial entity powers, but there are some harms, the best way to win the debate is to be able to be the team that's able to explain why you best balance these things out. And we explain to you why we're far more likely to balance these things out. We explain to you then that if there's a strong narrative to be pro-colonial, that's why you need the pervasive narrative to counter that pro-colonial narrative, right? It is only the way for you to be able to untangle a lot of these current myths already. And therefore, the outcome is not the outcome that everyone just hates the colonial masters, which is what is assumed by opening government, but rather people become more reasonable and rational in dealing with the colonial matters because they're existent on both sides of the house. The only response to this is people were already exposed to the suffering and therefore they're likely to be anti-colonial. We win this point because the importance here is not the recognition that you are suffering or that you're poor, but the attribution for the reasons as to why you're poor in the first place, which colonial determinism is able to provide because it links everything to the colonial structures, and therefore you're able to blame them. So even if people were poor under colonialism, they're likely to blame other things like the dissidents, the rebels at that time, the fact that their environment is problematic, or the fact that they're naturally not as strong. So it's unlikely they're going to blame the pro-colonial masters because a lot of the speech is suppressed at that particular point in time. That is why, even if you believe that colonial determinism is somewhat problematic, it's significantly more important than a pro-colonial narrative with all their harms of pervasiveness, but also no ability for you to reasonably challenge the structures that cause a lot of the suffering in these countries. For those reasons, we clearly take the debate. Thank you.
I would like to thank everyone for that excellent debate. If now the live stream could perhaps be paused, then the panel could, I suppose, start deliberating.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.